The glass panes of Terminal B were fogged from the inside, blurring the silhouettes of rushing travelers and flickering departure boards. But outside, the cold was clean and sharp, typical of Frankfurt in early December 1983. A dull gray sky hung low over the runways, and the hum of diesel buses blended with the rhythmic announcements echoing in German, English, and French. Amidst the chaos of luggage carts and holiday travelers, a man in a Soviet-style trench coat moved with quiet precision, his breath steaming in the frigid air as he stepped into the sheltered phone booth near Gate 17. The booth was tucked beside a vending machine and overlooked by a surveillance camera whose lens had been frosted by cold condensation, rendering it more symbolic than functional. He inserted 3 Deutsche Mark coins into the payphone with a mechanical clink, his gloved fingers steady, yet his eyes betraying tension as they scanned the terminal one last time. He dialed a number committed to memory, no written trace, and after 3 rings, a voice answered in clipped Russian. The man leaned in slightly, shielding his mouth from the glass, as if the cold could somehow listen in, and spoke 3 words, Nachalo vklucheno taper. Then, without another breath, he hung up. No name, no code, no confirmation, just the sound of the receiver returning to its cradle and the faint creak of the booth's door as he stepped back into the crowd. Within 20 minutes, a listening post housed beneath RAF Menwith Hill intercepted the call, flagged it due to the number's Soviet diplomatic route, and relayed it to GCHQ in Cheltenham. By the time the coffee pots had cooled in the NSA's Fort Meade operations room, a linguist had translated the phrase, "It has begun now," and analysts were scrambling to determine context. Simultaneously, Soviet communications traffic spiked subtly but significantly. In Moscow, 2 KGB signal officers were awakened at 3:14 a.m. to examine anomalies in Western intercepts, and within the hour, a priority dispatch marked Polaris Echo was on its way to the head of Directorate S. On the NATO side, briefings circulated with escalating urgency. Was this a code, a prelude to a strike, a trigger phrase? The timing was suspicious. It coincided with the early stages of NATO's Able Archer exercise, a simulation so realistic that the Soviets had already begun suspecting it as a cover for a real attack. In Brussels, SHAPE commanders placed strategic bomber crews on ready alert. In Moscow, Andropov's advisors debated activating early-stage protocols for Operation Ryan, the Soviet program designed to detect signs of a surprise nuclear attack. No one knew who the man was or what exactly he meant, but intelligence agencies on both sides understood something with grim clarity. This wasn't an accident, and it wasn't meaningless. In a world held in balance by mistrust and second-guessing, 3 words muttered into a payphone could be all it took to unhinge the silence. In the early 1980s, the Cold War had entered one of its most volatile and paranoid phases, a time when rhetoric, ideology, and nuclear capability collided under the weight of mutual suspicion and miscalculation. 1983, in particular, was a year soaked in anxiety and shadowed by existential dread. U.S. President Ronald Reagan had labeled the Soviet Union an evil empire just months earlier, a declaration not merely rhetorical, but symbolic of a broader shift in American foreign policy, one that abandoned détente in favor of strategic pressure and military escalation. On the Soviet side, the Kremlin, under the brittle and ailing leadership of Yuri Andropov, interpreted every Western move through a lens of siege mentality, convinced that the West, led by an unpredictable, seemingly militant president, was preparing a first strike to decapitate Soviet leadership before they could retaliate. The situation was worsened by the deployment of Pershing II missiles in West Germany, whose reduced flight time of only 6 to 10 minutes to Moscow triggered an existential fear within the Soviet General Staff that a nuclear sneak attack could arrive with no time for a response, wiping out command and control before a counterstrike could even be issued. In response, the Soviets initiated Operation Ryan, short for Raketno-Yadernoye Napadenie, or Nuclear Missile Attack, an intelligence directive that tasked KGB officers around the globe with gathering and reporting even the faintest hints of Western nuclear preparations. But Ryan wasn't based on evidence. It was based on anticipation, fear, and a deep belief that the Americans might one day strike without warning, That belief gained strength every time NATO conducted a military exercise, and the most dangerous of them all was Able Archer 83, a command post drill that simulated a transition from conventional to nuclear operations, complete with realistic coded communications, mock missile launches, and even the movement of officials to alternate command sites. To the West, it was a test of coordination and readiness. To the Soviets, it looked terrifyingly real. They believed that under the guise of exercises, the U.S. might attempt a decapitating nuclear strike that would wipe out Moscow's leadership and leave the USSR paralyzed. The KGB monitored unusual Western activity with obsessive detail: sudden changes in embassy behavior, spikes in energy use at military facilities, high-level absences from Washington or London. All were logged, analyzed, and reported with increasing alarm. In this climate of hair-trigger readiness, ordinary events became suspect. A drill could be war, a routine deployment, a provocation, and a cryptic phrase overheard on a tapped phone line could tip the scales toward apocalypse. The world was watching itself through a cracked mirror, misinterpreting reflections as threats. There was no trust, no margin for error, no capacity for benign misunderstanding. In this atmosphere, diplomacy, frayed, and intelligence ruled, with hawks on both sides ready to act before asking. It was a world where a payphone in an airport, a simple, everyday object, could become a fuse. And when that fuse was lit, the question wasn't whether it would burn, but how long it would take to reach the bomb. He was known to the West only as Anton in the earliest debriefings, and to the Soviets he no longer had a name, struck from records, purged from the files of Directorate T within weeks of his disappearance. But on that bitter December morning in 1983, he was just a man with a secret and a window that was closing fast. His real name, Oleg Dmitrievich Vlasenko, wouldn't come to light until years later, when partially declassified CIA documents and German intelligence leaks finally confirmed that the man who had set in motion a chain of events nearly triggering World War III was, in fact, a mid-tier linguist and field analyst for the GRU, with a conscience sharpened to a fatal point. Vlasenko wasn't high-ranking. He didn't have nuclear codes or the keys to Kremlin vaults, but what he did have was something arguably more dangerous in that moment: context. He had seen, through his time embedded with a listening station near Vienna, and through occasional postings at Soviet embassies in Brussels and The Hague, the growing paranoia infecting Soviet intelligence. He had seen how thin the line had become between reconnaissance and retribution, how the algorithms behind Operation Ryan were registering NATO exercises as evidence of imminent war, and how his superiors, already convinced that a Western strike was not a matter of if, but when, were beginning to talk in contingency language, assigning staff to alternate locations, withdrawing key personnel from posts, and circulating rumors of a doctrine change that would permit a first strike under specific pretexts. Vlasenko, disillusioned by the death of a friend during a KGB internal audit, and haunted by the creeping realization that his country was preparing to lurch forward blindly into the abyss, made contact in late November with an intermediary from the West German BND under the guise of a language conference in Cologne, and he struck a desperate deal. In exchange for safe passage, he would deliver an urgent warning, one not of a specific attack, but of a mindset, of a red-line psychology taking hold in the Soviet leadership that made the accidental look intentional and the ambiguous look hostile. But plans unraveled when the BND contact vanished without warning, days before their agreed extraction. Vlasenko, now isolated and knowing that his clearance was being reviewed back in Moscow, panicked. He rerouted himself to Frankfurt under a false name, blending in as a Yugoslav tourist, and found the payphone after a night spent in the terminal lounge, watching travelers and waiting for a decision to form. He called the Soviet consulate switchboard in Brussels, not to confess or betray, but to disrupt, to inject uncertainty into the system. "Nachalov Klucheno Teper," he said into the receiver, voice tight with frost and adrenaline. "It's in motion. We don't have time." But the operator on the other end didn't recognize the voice or the code and flagged the call as anomalous. Within 45 minutes, that anomaly was on tape, flagged by a SIGINT operator in Ramstein, translated by GCHQ, and relayed to Washington and Langley. To Vlasenko, the words were meant as a warning, vague enough to protect him if intercepted, precise enough to sow doubt within the KGB. But to the tangled machinery of global espionage, those 6 syllables were gasoline on already smoldering coals. The call was captured at 0842 CET by a West German SIGINT relay station near Bad Aibling, a satellite interception post jointly operated by the Americans and the Bundesnachrichtendienst, and routed through a secure channel to the UK's government communications headquarters in Cheltenham, where, within minutes, a young linguist on the Russian desk flagged it for immediate escalation. Not because the voice was known, or because the call was long, but because of its eerie, tightly spoken message, Nachalo Vyklusheno Teper, followed by an abrupt disconnect, no follow-up, no password validation, no contextual chatter. It was, in the words of the analyst's report, an isolated, forceful utterance suggestive of coded urgency. The call's origin, Frankfurt International Airport, was noted, but its destination raised more alarms. A known Soviet diplomatic switchboard in Brussels, a hub routinely used by embassy staff, commercial liaisons, and, covertly, Directorate S field officers operating under diplomatic cover. What stood out was not just what was said, but when it was said. The date, December the 2nd, 1983. The significance, Day 1 of NATO's Able Archer exercise, a command post drill simulating a transition from conventional to nuclear warfare with unprecedented realism, including live-coded messages, relocated command personnel, and a nuclear release simulation so detailed that, to outside observers, it blurred the line between drill and preparation. By 09:05, the report had landed on the desk of an operations liaison at Fort Meade, and from there it was pushed to NSA's Section G10, the division responsible for interpreting foreign military communications. A crisis meeting was called by 09:17 EST. The contents of the call were dissected with clinical urgency. It's in motion. We don't have time. What was in motion? A military strike? A counter-operation? A destabilization effort? The lack of clarity was part of the problem. This wasn't a standard coded phrase from any known Soviet encryption dictionary. It didn't match prior Ryan communications or military intercepts. Worse, the tone and timing made it plausible that this was an emergency escalation within the Soviet chain of command, possibly triggered by perceived NATO aggression. The phrase, ambiguous in translation, could mean an operation had started, or simply that something was no longer stoppable. Panic at this point did not mean screaming. It meant accelerated briefings, secure calls on STU-3 phones between Langley and RAF Molesworth, hurried code word classified cables stamped with red ink, and the quiet arrival of military advisors at NORAD to recheck posture status. NATO command in Mons, Belgium, was informed. Their response, double-check readiness levels discreetly. No one was ready to declare a formal alert, but the paranoia was growing. GCHQ requested additional listening coverage on all outbound traffic from Brussels, while the CIA asked the IBND to begin identifying anyone matching the voice print in Frankfurt on December the 2nd. Analysts in both hemispheres began scrubbing back through satellite traffic, looking for patterns that might confirm or dispel the fear taking hold. Had someone, some rogue asset, some lost node, just triggered a sequence? Had the Soviets misinterpreted Able Archer as a cover for a real nuclear attack? Or had someone inside the Soviet system just tried to stop it and failed? In the silence that followed the call, one thing became clear. Uncertainty could be as dangerous as intent. The moment the anomalous call was logged by a duty officer inside the Soviet consulate in Brussels and transmitted through secure channels back to Moscow, the reaction inside the Kremlin was not swift panic, but something far more dangerous. Methodical suspicion, the kind that metastasizes quietly through a system already primed to expect betrayal, infiltration, or imminent annihilation. The transcript landed first in the hands of the Second Chief Directorate, where a night shift lieutenant noted the lack of authentication code and elevated it to his superior, who in turn forwarded it to the duty colonel overseeing counterintelligence operations. And by the time the sun rose over the frozen rooftops of Moscow, the message, 3 cryptic words, their meaning uncertain, their origin chilling, had been stamped with a red diagonal slash indicating potential compromise of Soviet communication channels. The KGB's internal security branch immediately suspected a mole, believing that no trained operative would utter such a phrase without following proper protocol unless they had been turned, coerced, or were attempting to signal something unauthorized. Others argued the opposite, that the voice could have belonged to a rogue agent attempting to warn them of a Western move, perhaps even a signal of impending NATO escalation under the guise of Able Archer. The fact that the call was placed from Frankfurt, an epicenter of Western intelligence activity, only sharpened the paranoia. Meetings were convened in windowless rooms beneath the Lubyanka, where KGB officers debated whether the call represented a breach, a trap, or a garbled attempt at warning, and within hours, a preliminary Ryan alert was filed to the center, an internal alarm signifying the slightest possibility of a U.S. surprise attack. Operation Ryan was built on the belief that the Americans would one day launch a sudden, crushing first strike designed to decapitate Soviet military and political leadership before it could retaliate. Its mandate was simple but terrifying. Report anything that might be a precursor to nuclear war, from unusual embassy lights to sudden blood donations in Western capitals, to the absence of parked cars outside government buildings. Now, with Able Archer running at full simulation fidelity, the message from Frankfurt fit neatly, too neatly, into the framework of worst-case interpretations. Within the Kremlin's Defense Council, Andropov's advisors debated whether the phrase, "it's in motion, we don't have time," referred to NATO nuclear mobilization, a Western covert operation, or internal sabotage. Trust fractured along institutional lines. The GRU accused the KGB of losing control of its own assets. The KGB accused military intelligence of withholding field reports. Foreign ministry officials pleaded for restraint, while hardliners argued that any hesitation could be fatal if the message was genuine. A chilling question, never spoken aloud, nevertheless threaded through every conversation. Is this it? Had the West finally decided to strike? Or had someone inside the Soviet apparatus, terrified of an accidental war, tried and failed to stop the clock? As the Kremlin wrestled with competing fears, one truth lingered like frost on the windows. The line between vigilance and desperation was growing dangerously thin, and all it had taken to shake the foundations of the world's largest intelligence system was a single voice whispering into a payphone. The spiral began with silence, ominous, empty silence, that followed the intercepted call like a shadow, allowing each side to fill the void with its own fears and assumptions. And what followed was not a calculated decision to escalate, but a series of reflexes, each grounded in misinterpretation, each pushing the world closer to catastrophe without a single missile being armed. In Washington, the president's daily briefing contained an urgent addendum, a Soviet origin message intercepted via SIGINT, possibly indicating movement within Soviet command, or, worse, a covert green light for an attack already in progress. The analysts at the CIA and NSA debated furiously in a secure chamber beneath Langley, flipping through tone analyses, matching the voice print from Frankfurt against KGB operatives, and poring over Soviet naval telemetry. Nothing concrete emerged, but uncertainty itself became the threat. The Joint Chiefs ordered that Strategic Air Command increase its alert status to DEFCON 3. Not a war posture, but a readiness one step closer to global conflict. Nuclear-equipped submarines silently shifted in the depths of the Arctic and North Atlantic, repositioning into second strike corridors. Air Force reconnaissance aircraft, RC-135s and TR-1s, launched on short notice from bases in England, Germany, and Turkey, tasked with photographing Soviet airfields, ports, and mobile radar systems to detect any patterns indicating launch preparations. The Soviets noticed the uptick. To them, it looked like the U.S. was verifying targeting data, one of the final phases before a nuclear strike. Meanwhile, in Moscow, Soviet military command parsed Western reconnaissance not as reaction, but as confirmation. The Americans are finalizing coordinates, one general told another in a closed session of the Politburo's Defense Subcommittee. They have found the gaps. Andropov, already ill and physically confined to his dacha, was receiving reports that appeared to support the worst-case scenario: troop movement in West Germany, encrypted cable surges out of London and Washington, and most critically, anomalies detected by Soviet electronic monitoring in American early warning systems, interpreted as rehearsals for a decapitation strike. GRU analysts reported increased signal traffic between NATO command nodes. KGB Director Viktor Chebrikov, alarmed by the implications, ordered contingency units across the Western Soviet Union to prepare for heightened situational defense, a euphemism for the initial stages of nuclear readiness. Elsewhere, in underground silos outside Saratov, technicians ran quiet checks on launch mechanisms while maintaining the fiction of routine drills. Neither side could admit to the other what they feared, that they didn't know if this was real or not. And so, both hedged towards survival, which paradoxically meant inching closer to the edge. By the evening of December 2nd, 20 hours after the phone call, both NATO and Soviet military infrastructures had begun to silently slide into their respective postures of strategic ambiguity, a condition where misinterpretation becomes indistinguishable from intent, and all of it, every scrambled jet, every sonar ping, every double-locked missile hatch, had been triggered by 6 words spoken by a desperate man into a metal payphone as snow drifted against the glass outside Frankfurt International. No declaration had been made, no button had been pushed, but the machine of war had begun to turn. The unraveling began not with a satellite feed or intercepted cable, but with a memory, a hunch sparked by a cigarette break outside a safe house in West Berlin, where a CIA field officer known only by the code name Anson stared at a cryptic dispatch from Langley and remembered a conversation from 3 weeks earlier with a jittery informant who had spoken of a man named Mirov, a mid-level GRU linguist, with clearance high enough to glimpse patterns, but low enough to feel disposable. That name, Oleg Mirov, had passed through Anson's notes like a ghost, flagged but unverified, tagged as unstable, unreliable, sweats when asked simple questions, likely scared of his own shadow, the report had said. But now, reading the contents of the intercepted call and noting the strange urgency and choice of words, Anson made the connection. He contacted his liaison at Station Berlin, and within 2 hours, a team of analysts was combing through chatter from November and early December, comparing voice prints and cross-referencing movements near Frankfurt International. A single transit record, train to Frankfurt Hauptbahnhof, dated December 1st, paid in cash, was traced back to a known associate of Mirov's, a former embassy translator who had previously served in Brussels. Suddenly, the outline came into focus. Mirov hadn't been signaling the start of a strike. He had been running. Running not from NATO or from the Americans, but from something inside his own system, a purge. According to partially decrypted chatter between Moscow and its diplomatic outposts, the GRU had initiated an internal audit, routine on the surface, but with an unusually aggressive pattern of personnel suspensions, investigations, and mysterious disappearances. These audits, field officers knew, weren't just bureaucratic. They were often a prelude to something darker. Mirov, stationed in Brussels under a diplomatic cover, had likely caught wind that his name was on a list, not because he was guilty of betrayal, but because he had voiced doubts during internal briefings, asked questions about the logic of Operation Ryan, questioned why analysts were being told to assume hostile intent in all Western activities. In a climate of deepening suspicion, questions were dangerous, and Mirov knew it. He panicked. He fled. He reached Frankfurt on forged documents and waited for his contact, likely a German intermediary. But when that person failed to show, Mirov improvised. The payphone call wasn't part of a plan. It was an act of desperation, a flare shot into a blizzard. "It's in motion! We don't have time!" He had meant the purge. He had meant his own vanishing window to escape. But in the ears of surveillance machines built to detect coded threats, his plea sounded like a trigger. By 4:10 a.m. Berlin time, a classified memo from Station Berlin reached Langley confirming the identity of the voice as Oleg Mirov and recommending immediate de-escalation through back channels. The war that wasn't had nearly begun because of a man trying not to disappear. And now, the machinery of global conflict had to be walked back, not through power, but through interpretation. Understanding had become the only way to survive. By the time the sun rose over Geneva on December 3rd, 1983, the air in the American consulate's secure conference room was thick with unspoken relief and diplomatic friction, as a quiet but urgent call between mid-level U.S. and Soviet diplomats began under the sterile glow of fluorescent lights and the shadow of mutual distrust. The room was swept for bugs twice, and the line, an aging secure teletype link retrofitted for voice, crackled with the tension of two empires inching back from a precipice neither would publicly acknowledge. The conversation, officially unscheduled and conducted off the record, was initiated under the guise of routine verification of communications protocols during ongoing NATO exercises. Nothing that would attract attention, nothing that would be cited in cables. The U.S. envoy, a seasoned State Department official named Carter Wells, opened the exchange with careful language, referencing potential misinterpretations of recent signal intelligence and seeking confirmation that no unusual military actions had been authorized from Moscow. The Soviet representative, Anatoly Markov, whose voice bore the gravelly fatigue of a man who had slept little in the past 48 hours, responded in kind, stating flatly, "We are monitoring your exercises. As of now, there is no change in posture from our side. We assume the same applies to yours. No accusations, no references to Frankfurt, no mention of Operation Ryan or Oleg Mirov. It was a performance of plausible ignorance on both sides, a ballet of denial where silence spoke volumes. The implication, mutually understood but diplomatically invisible, was that both powers had glimpsed the abyss and had no interest in describing what they saw. Intelligence officers in both nations watched the exchange with bated breath, waiting for code words, for flares of hostility or hints of preparation. But none came. Just vague confirmations, ceremonial reassurances, and a tacit agreement to keep the world ignorant of how close it had come to unmaking itself over a misunderstanding. After 17 minutes, the call ended with the neutral phrase, "We will maintain our existing channels," and both envoys hung up, each returning to his side's respective intelligence briefings to issue the same verdict. Containment achieved, no further escalation expected. In Washington and Moscow, the event was filed away, buried under layers of classification, and given an anodyne label in the archives. Inconclusive Incident, Diplomatic Communications Review, DEC 1983. Analysts who had been on call during the crisis were rotated out. Memos were sealed, and the paper trail was scrubbed of urgency. Even within the agencies that had tracked the crisis minute by minute, only a handful of individuals understood the full scope of what had happened. The message was clear. History would not record how close the world had come, not from malice or doctrine, but from fear, from guesswork, from a phone call whispered in code. There would be no press release, no policy shift, no lessons taught in diplomatic schools, just silence. The kind that settles after a nightmare you don't want to explain. The kind that holds the world together with the fragile thread of mutual pretense. Three weeks after the phone call that had rippled like a fault line through the intelligence networks of two superpowers, Oleg Mirov was found half-conscious in a nondescript safe house tucked above a shuttered bookstore on a quiet street in Vienna's Neubau district, his face gaunt, fingers trembling from days of malnutrition and paranoia, the gun he had purchased on the black market lying unloaded beneath a thin mattress. His extraction had been improvised, facilitated by a freelance B&D operative with CIA ties who had monitored chatter about a rogue GRU officer moving east from Frankfurt. And when the door to the safe house finally opened on January the 2nd, 1984, the man who emerged did not look like someone who had nearly started World War III. He looked like someone who had barely survived himself. The debriefing lasted 9 days, conducted in a disused Austrian government building, with CIA handlers flown in under diplomatic cover. And while Mirov provided no groundbreaking intelligence, no new weapons data, or high-level insights, what he did offer was a harrowing account of institutional paranoia within the GRU, of lists drawn up without evidence, of colleagues disappearing after private conversations, of commanders interpreting NATO exercises as imminent threats based solely on tone and pattern, and of a system so tightly wound with fear that even internal questions were treated as subversion. He had seen his own name on a list left unattended for mere seconds during a late-night audit and had fled within hours, unaware that his warning would trigger a multinational panic. After the sessions ended, Mirov was quietly relocated under a new identity to a remote township in British Columbia, where he was given a modest stipend, a small cottage, and instructions never to speak publicly of what had happened. Not to neighbors, not to journalists, not even in letters. In Washington and Brussels, the incident was shelved under sanitized headings, but behind the scenes, its impact lingered. NATO initiated a classified review of Able Archer protocols, resulting in stricter coordination with diplomatic channels and the creation of fallback communication procedures in case of intelligence misreads. The Pentagon quietly modified its alert drills to include perception tests, analyzing how simulated actions might appear to hostile observers. In Moscow, the fallout was more opaque, but no less real. Operation Ryan was quietly curtailed in its extremity. GRU field agents were instructed to flag anomalies without escalating unless secondary confirmation existed. And a new internal policy emerged, never codified in writing, that required 2 independent sources before triggering strategic alerts. Neither side admitted publicly that anything had changed, but the shift in posture was unmistakable to those watching closely. The near disaster birthed a strange humility, a recognition that the world's survival had hung not on treaties or doctrines, but on the mercy of miscommunication, on the accident of delay, on a man whose voice was mistaken for a signal of war when it had only ever been a cry for help. No missiles had flown, no cities burned, but the memory of almost had left its mark. In the vast ice-thin calculus of the Cold War, where nations watched each other through satellite lenses and the nervous eyes of double agents, it wasn't always weapons or declarations that moved the needle toward catastrophe. It was whispers, fragments, and misread intentions. A word out of place, a silence too long. A payphone message spoken into the churn of an airport terminal could be as dangerous as any missile silo keyed to launch. And in December of 1983, one man's breathless utterance, "It's in motion, we don't have time," proved how quickly the world's most advanced intelligence systems could pivot from monitoring to mobilizing, from analysis to panic, all because no one could afford to be wrong. In that era, every message was read for what it might mean, not necessarily what it did mean, and suspicion had become its own kind of doctrine. The airport payphone, a relic of analog life and anonymous passage, became the stage for a drama that nearly broke the back of peace, not through malice or design, but because a man tried to warn someone, anyone, before the shadows swallowed him, and in doing so stumbled into the most dangerous language on earth, uncertainty. The call wasn't intercepted by fate. It was captured by design, by machines and operators trained to listen for ghosts in wires and meaning in static. That system did its job. But what no system could do was decode the intent behind trembling words in real time. The Cold War was a world of codebooks and context, where meaning only existed if you knew which version of the truth someone believed in. For every cipher, there were 10 assumptions. For every warning, a dozen counter-arguments. And so, as nuclear bombers warmed their engines and Soviet command considered activating Operation Ryan, what stood between annihilation and survival wasn't clarity, but a pause. A hesitation bred of doubt, of bureaucratic delay, of someone, somewhere, deciding to wait just a little longer before acting. That hesitation saved the world, not understanding. And in the aftermath, when Oleg Mirov was quietly relocated to the blank snowfields of Canada and his warning became a footnote no one wanted to acknowledge, the lesson that lingered was not one of heroism, but of haunting. That in a world this brittle, where empires were wired together by paranoia, sometimes silence is the last defense against destruction. Because in the Cold War, truth was only as safe as the person hearing it. And if the wrong ears caught the right words, the result wasn't knowledge, it was war. The whisper in Frankfurt didn't destroy cities or launch missiles, but it showed how close a whisper could come. It reminded us that power is not always loud, and that history's greatest dangers often begin not with shouts across borders, but with quiet voices in places no one notices. Until it's too late. The payphone is gone now, dismantled, forgotten. Its booth replaced by vending machines and plastic signage. But the echo of that moment remains, humming just beneath the surface of everything we survived. If this story gripped you, imagine how many more Cold War secrets are still buried beneath history's silence. Subscribe for more untold stories, near misses, and forgotten moments that shape the fate of the world, one whisper at a time.